So, last week, real quick recap, we said that after reading through something like Daniel 11, and then as I lost you in our history lesson, but that there's no denying God's foreknowledge, that God was giving Daniel descriptions. And so when you read through the vision that God begins to give him, we begin to see the truth, even down to something as specific as verse 2 in Daniel 11, that there were three kings, and that there were three more kings. And then you can look into when it says there, and a fourth shall be richer, that was Xerxes, and that's how that happened. And then a mighty king that would have great dominion, that was Alexander the Great. And so then his kingdom would be broken and divided toward four winds of heaven, that we saw that on the heels of his Alexander the Great's reign, that there were four great empires and generals of their own that came out, and that two of them end up being primary and predominant. And then we see those northern and southern kings, and this is where I lost you last week. So I've given you a handout that you can take home. You can throw it away if that's what you end up doing. We're not going to walk back through all of this today, but you do have a chance if you would like to read back through. And so what I did is I gave you a little bit of a grid that shows you the kings of the north and the kings of the south that are being referred to here in Daniel chapter 11. And then I went through the verses and kind of pulled. I had some really great resources that I was working off of last week. And so I've copied and pasted those in so that when you read something like, and just look real quick if you want to, Daniel chapter 11, verse 5, there in the handout I gave you, it says, the king of the south shall be strong. And so then you just see that just real quickly, I tried to type under there that the king of the south is Ptolemy the first. And you can go look in your little chart and see who Ptolemy the first was. And so hopefully that helps you a little bit to see that God gives all of this in a vision to Daniel, and then we can walk through history and correlate these events, these people, and see that we just really can't deny God's foreknowledge. And then one of the things that piggybacked on that is that we have to always keep what we know of the Lord in context to the whole picture of what God has revealed. That from the beginning of time, God is carrying out a plan and a purpose, and so that his foreknowledge, the way I said it last week, is that it's superseded by his plan. And so God's redemptive plan, from the beginning of the world until the end, everything is unfolding according to God's plan. So his foreknowledge sits maybe subservient to or under his plan. Here's what I would say. The reverse would that be, if God's foreknowledge is bigger than his planning, then that would mean God is planning in response to what he sees happening in the future. But what we know of Scripture is God teaches us that, like you go to Ephesians chapter 1, that Christ was the plan before the foundation of the world. So before the world was made, Jesus was the plan. And so if Jesus is the plan before the foundation of the world, then all that God knows, his foreknowledge, is because of his plan. He doesn't look down the corridors of history and then make his plans based on what he sees happening. What God sees happening in the future, his foreknowledge, is the result of his plan. It's what he's doing. And so then that means the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus is God's plan. It wasn't just something that he knew would unfold. It unfolded because it was his plan. And so when we think theologically and doctrinally in Scripture, God's plan is always what is driving everything else that's unfolding. So when God gives a vision through an angel to Daniel and tells him this is what's going to happen, God's foreknowledge wasn't, he was able to look down the corridors of time and just kind of relay to Daniel what would happen in the future. That'd be more like a psychic, like an earthly psychic type person. But God is unfolding the plan. Hey, this is what I know is going to happen, Daniel, because things are unfolding according to my plan, and you can trust me. And so that was kind of our recap from last week. said. God's I appreciate you saying it was good. God's plan is what's driving the unfolding of everything else. Like what he knows is the result of his plan. If not, then he is not an omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient God. Like he loses power if what he's doing is because of his ability to see the future. He sees the future under the umbrella of his plan. So nothing is happening in the world that is ever a surprise to him, and nothing is happening in the events that are happening and the powers that are rising and falling and the nations that are being birthed and that are crumbling. All of that is happening under the umbrella of his plan. So what we would call sovereignty would just be kind of if I was tiering my doctrines, I would put his sovereignty and his plan at the top. So just being God, that would be just a characteristic of him. So, but in doing that last week, we took some time to do that, and then one of the other things that we did last week was that we looked at verses 36 through 45. So if you want to pull those out, one of the reasons that we did the timeline that I passed out to you is because up until verse 35, we have a really clear historical record. Like we can say very clearly as we move our way from chapter 11, verse 5, all the way to verse 35, it's pretty much understood who we're talking about here, who the kings were. In fact, all the way up to verse 35, you move in terms of your rulers. This one I gave you the handout. In terms of your rulers, you're moving from the southern and northern kings and all of their battles, and then you get to verse 21. And in verse 21, this begins to transition to a king that we would call Antiochus Epiphanes. Hang on. Not 21. When we get to... Yeah, so in 21, Antiochus IV captures the throne, and Antiochus Epiphanes is Antiochus IV. So in your chart, you've got the northern kings and the southern kings, but then when all this is over in verse 21, Antiochus the fourth captures the throne and he begins to reign. And as he reigns, we get kind of a sum of his life and of his work all the way through verse 35. And then when we get to verse 36, that's when scholars, Bible teachers begin to go in different directions. And so one of the things that we pointed out last week is that there are basically three, I would say you've got three main interpretations of, we'll say Daniel 11, 36 through 45. So you got three main interpretations when it comes to Daniel 11, 36 through 45. And what I mean is there's a who in those verses. So who are we talking about? Who is the person that is troubling Israel? Like who is the person in verses 36 through 45 that is troubling, persecuting, and causing the tribulations that we see in verses 36 through 45. And so you have option one. There are some who would say this is the Antichrist, beginning in verse 36. You would have others that would say, when you get there, now you're talking Rome. And then others would say, we're still talking about Antiochus the Fourth. Talked a little bit about the different kind of ways to think about that. So, and I'm not telling you which one of these you have to agree with. I know where I land, but like I've told many people, I don't know, catch me in 2 years, I could change. And so, and you'll find that with a lot of the end time prophecies, because sometimes it's hard to nail this down. Jesus said you're not going to know, and so we don't need to be too determined. But I do think at least with the book of Daniel, I think we can be a little more confident in interpreting it. But so if you're the Antichrist, then as you're reading through the book of Daniel, when you come to verse 36, if you believe from this point forward, the book of Daniel is referring to the end of all time and the Antichrist, then between 35 and 36, you jump thousands of years forward. So that would be your interpretation of that verse. If you believe it is Rome, then you are jumping hundreds of years forward. Immediately in verse 36, and if you hang in there with it, we're still talking about Antiochus IV, then you just keep trucking that this is continuing to describe his rule and his reign. And so I shared with you guys last week that I land with number 3, that I read verses 36 through 45, believing that we're continuing to talk about Antiochus IV, in large part because there's no indication that we've changed who we're talking about. There's no, and from verse 5, well, actually verse 2 of chapter 11, all the way through verse 35, we're really clear. Like there's a very clear line of succession from king to king to king to king. And then in verse 36, there's no indication that we have changed who we are talking about. And so for me, when I'm reading and interpreting Daniel chapter 11, without an indicator, without some type of shift in who we're talking about and who we're referring to, I find myself just kind of hanging in there with that's who we're talking about. And because they're still talking about kings of the north, kings of the south, I just think for me, it all continues to fit together. But I have really good friends who completely disagree, so it's okay. But one of the things I wanted to point out today as we read through Daniel chapter 12, and what I want to try to show you as we walk through Daniel chapter 12, is how you interpret verses 36 through 45 has to influence how you read Daniel chapter 12. Because it's not the chapters in the book of Daniel are our divisions. Mankind made up the divisions in the books of the Bible. So like Daniel is a book that was given to us, and we've given it numbers, and we've given it the structure so that we could easily find it when we're reading through our Bible and reference it, and so that we could easily memorize it. So there's just a consistent flow of thought that's happening from verse 45 into Daniel 12, verse 1. So if you interpret it as this is referencing the Antichrist, then everything that we're going to read in Daniel chapter 12 would be in reference to the Antichrist. If you believe it's Rome, most people in that camp would say that what's being referenced here is the destruction of the temple in and around 70 AD, that it would be talking about the events, the 3 to 3.5 years of events that would precede the destruction of the temple. If you believe it's the Antichrist, then you believe this is talking about the last few years of his rule and his reign on earth before he is destroyed. And if you believe that it's Antiochus IV, then you believe that we are talking about the period of time characterizing the last 3 to 3.5 years of his reign during his lifetime. And so that's why, as we read through the Bible, I keep trying every now and then to throw kind of in your laps, like how you interpret the Bible in one place should dictate and influence how you are interpreting the Bible in other places, so that we're consistent. Because it would be you can't jump to verse 36 and say, I think this is about the Antichrist, and then go back to Antiochus in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 12, and you can't say that you think Daniel 11, 36 through 45 is about Antiochus, and then jump. I would make one caveat towards the end of Daniel chapter 12, where you could all of a sudden run a few thousand years ahead if you wanted. But so part of what I'm trying to help us do over time is to maybe build some consistency in the way that we're reading our Bible, because I think you'll notice when you start jumping from preacher and teacher and author, whether you realize it or not, you're jumping often from theological system to theological system. Like if you listen to one preacher, he may be interpreting and reading the Bible through an entirely different interpretive lens, as big as you could be listening to someone like me preach who believes that Daniel chapter 11 is about Antiochus. You could go listen to another preacher who says it's about the Antichrist. And then how we preach about other prophecies are going to be connected to that type of interpretive difference. And those, we said early on with this section in the book of Daniel, that how you interpret this or this is because often how you believe God has revealed himself throughout the entire Bible. Most people who would say this is the Antichrist would fall into a category that we've defined as dispensationalism, believing that the Bible is written and God's revelation is through a series of dispensations, and that those are sections of eras of history. But if you're a progressive covenantal person like I am, then you're going to land with Antiochus in Daniel chapter 11, but you're also going to do the book of Revelation differently than each one of us would do that. And so one of the reasons that sometimes we have so many questions when we listen to different teachers and read different authors is because you're reading from different schools of interpretation. You're reading from different theological perspectives. I'm not telling you not to do that. I'm just telling you that that's why sometimes there's such difference and gap. So if you read a dispensationalist and you love them and you think they're great, like a Schofield or a Ryrie, and you're just all in, or I think John Hagee would probably factor in today as a kind of a modern day dispensationalist. If you jump into those camps, but then you run over and pick, say, a great Presbyterian from history and read one of their books or one of their sermons, well, they're not going to be where he is. And because their overall system is different in how that they read through the Bible and how they believe God has revealed himself through the Bible. And so I throw all that in your lap in hopes that you can, sometimes it's not so much that they disagree with each other in terms of like arguing, they have different frameworks. And I think it's okay to be exposed to more than one. But just know that that's just kind of how Christianity has been when it comes to some of these interpretive lenses. So, all right, so Daniel chapter 12, if you look there in verse 1, it says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So those first three verses, if you interpret it as the Antichrist, then in verse 1, you would say we're referring to the end-time tribulation under the final Antichrist. Verse 2 would be referring to the end-time resurrection, referred to in Isaiah chapter 26. And then if you jump to Antichrist, then the way you would interpret that, you would say this is referring to when the persecution ends, there will be a resurrection. And so one of the places where people who aim it at the Antichrist, the debate then becomes, when after the persecution will the resurrection occur? Will there be a resurrection into a 1,000-year millennial reign? Or will there be a resurrection and a complete end of all things at that time on the other side of a 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus? And so And that's not something that they really spent a whole lot of time worried about. But so interpretation number one, in the Antichrist camp, these few verses are referring to the end times, the tribulation under the final Antichrist, and the resurrection that comes in the future. And then if you see this as Rome, then you would refer to a later time of hardship and tribulation, most likely dealing with 66 to 70 A.D., and would believe that this happened under the leader of the Roman army, a man named Titus. And then in chapter 12, verse 2, you would then say that this is using imagery that we find all throughout the Old Testament. There's a consistent use of exaggerated imagery to explain and to convey the events. For instance, like in the book of Psalms, David is consistently drowning, but he's not drowning. David is consistently facing fire, but not actually facing fire. That you see throughout the Old Testament a lot of imagery being used with life and death, or circumstances that could convey something as serious as life or death, with very creative and demonstrative language to convey the seriousness of it. And so if you interpret it that way, then as you get here, you start seeing that kind of imaginative, creative, demonstrative language, very, very like, they're not in pastures, So in the Old Testament, you're not actually a sheep. You're like a sheep. And so some of the language that the Old Testament uses in reference to life and God's relationship with people and what's happening, there was a real flood, and it flooded the world. You see David often referring to the pit and being swallowed up by the pit. Well, there was actually a moment in the nation of Israel where the ground opened up and swallowed some of the people of Israel. There are moments where fire did descend from heaven and consume a sacrifice, where fire consumed cities in God's judgment. And so the language that gets used often in the Old Testament post those miraculous moments is describing current situations with that kind of imagery and that kind of wording. So if you fall into camp number 2 or number 3, then that's going to be how you would describe that David was not literally up to his neck in water in any of the Psalms, but that is how he felt. And so you would see that resurrection language and things like that in Daniel chapter 12 is in the same genre of writing and approach. So then when you get to verses 4 through 13, we begin to see more of this prophecy unfolded. In verse 4, it says, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until that time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." And so when we get here, we can kind of get away from our camps and just recognize that in verse 4, we're being told this needs to be kept safe. In the ancient Near East, in their time, it would have been really normal for there to be duplicate copies of anything of significance. It's really not that uncommon today. Like when you sign your life away to purchase your home, there is more than one copy of what you have signed. Right, Mike? And so, resident real estate lawyer in the room. And so you sign everything. There's a copy for you. There's a copy for them. There's a copy for the other people. There's a copy that just goes stuck somewhere in a file somewhere. And so that tradition would have been very much in place in their day. In fact, in Jeremiah 32, they're told to do that. In Jeremiah 32, in terms of buying a field, he said, "I bought the field at Anathoth from Hanamel, my cousin. I weighed out the money to him, 17 shekels of silver. I signed the deed, sealed it, got witnesses, and weighed the money on scales. Then I took the sealed deed of purchase containing the terms and conditions and the open copy. And then I gave the deed of purchase to Baruch, the son of Neri, the son of Messiah, in the presence of Hanamel, my cousin, in the presence of the witnesses who signed." And so we see this idea of sealing it up is really a normal way of talking. And so again, what you're looking for it to say, and we'll often interpret how you see, like, so in the book of Jeremiah, we don't believe that because he was told to seal that up and do this in front of witnesses and put it over here, we would say that the deed to land is a prophetic book about the future that no one could ever hear or know about again. And so when we put it into their time period and put it into their culture, this instruction to seal it up and keep it safe so that it could be brought out again would really help us to see that this is a serious thing. God intends for this to be kept. God intends for this to be recorded and to be able to be referenced again in the future. And so when you read there at the end of that verse about people shall run to and fro and knowledge shall increase, that in large part we see that same kind of language in the book of Amos. Amos chapter 8, verse 11 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine for bread or a thirst for water, but rather for hearing the words of the Lord. And people will stagger from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east. They will go to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, but they will not find it." And so when we think about the wording that's used here, this means that until this is done, people are going to go back and forth. Knowledge is going to increase, and that they're going back and forth is going to be for the purpose of gaining. They're going to want to know. People are going to want to know this. They're going to want to know what's been given. They're going to want to know what's going to happen. And here it is. It's been sealed. It's not going to change. Keep it safe. Keep it secure. Put a copy where no one can mess with it, and then let people know. And so when we look here, that it doesn't necessarily... here's what I would say. Some people say this verse in Daniel means that the end of times will not happen until people can travel great distances quickly, or people can get around the earth in a certain number of days. So I don't personally believe that it means that the end of time comes with an increase in travel, and that there is some people would say that the Messiah is not going to come and the Antichrist is not going to be revealed until there is a certain amount of knowledge on the earth. Until there's a certain amount of information gained by humanity and assumed by humanity. And so I don't know if these verses mean that, because I don't think that's what it necessarily meant in the book of Amos. I don't think that's then what it would mean here. But this is done. Like, this is sealed. This is promised. This is how it's going to go. And people are going to be going to and fro, trying to figure out, when is this going to happen? I mean, remember, Daniel is receiving this vision because they were told that when they went back to Jerusalem, that the walls would be rebuilt and the temple would be restored. And so he's now been fasting for 3 weeks before getting this vision, because when we read through the book of Ezra, the construction in Jerusalem stopped. Like, they were sent from the end of the 70 years of their captivity came to an end. Daniel did not go with the rest of them. He's in his 80s. He has stayed there where he's been helping to rule and to reign. Most of Israel has gone back to Jerusalem and Judah. They've gone home. And construction began, but then we know in the book of Ezra that construction stops. And that stoppage correlates with the fasting that Daniel goes into for 3 weeks, takes his friends, they go off, they're fasting, this vision happens to him, he gets this vision. So remember, like, Daniel himself is trying to ask the Lord, why hasn't this been done? You made a promise that the walls were going to be rebuilt, the temple was going to be restored. That got started, but then it comes to a screeching halt, so Daniel begins to fast and pray. And so even in Daniel's own life, he is in a situation where the promise has been made, but it has not been fulfilled. And so he is in a very similar situation to what we try to often aim thousands of years forward with. Like, God, this hasn't happened. He's seeking knowledge. He's seeking information from the Lord. And so we see this as kind of a normal way of Hebrew talking. This would not be an uncommon phrase, that they're going to and fro. They're trying to understand. They're trying to know. And God says, this is it. This is what's going to happen. This is complete. Seal it up. Keep it safe. And we do then eventually see that often when God gives this kind of information, there is a break and there is a pause. He's not going to communicate necessarily more about this. And we have that today. Like, we have a fulfilled, completed revelation of who God is, and we are waiting for him to finish and complete what he has told us he is going to do. And so there would be a lot of corollary to that. So it's complete, and they're going back and forth. They are trying to know. This does paint a picture of people trying to know and people trying to understand, but we have to also recognize it's not going to be any different than what God has said. So whatever they're trying to know and they're trying to understand, it's going to happen as he has said it's going to happen. And then in verse 5, he says, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream," remember, he's been talking to him, "How long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished." So here we have the man, the angel giving Daniel this revelation. And then all of a sudden there's two new people, one on either side of the river. And somebody then asked the one who's hovering above, "When is this going to be happening?" And so the significance of not just one hand raised to confirm his oath and promise, both hands raised. This is completely on the Lord. So there's a really neat moment where he says, listen, this is up to him. Like, this is a confirmation. These things are going to unfold, and when they unfold, it's going to be at the shattering of the power of the holy people, when all this comes to an end. And remember, depending on what you believe this is, determines on when you mean the end is. Because in Daniel chapter 7, we have already had this kind of destruction of the holy people of God given to us. So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, we talked then. I've been trying to keep this consistent. We talked then that you can interpret that as either the end-timed Antichrist, the Roman Empire, or Antiochus Epiphanes. And so how you interpret Daniel 7 also plays an impact here into what we think about Daniel chapter 11. And so if you believe that this is the Antichrist, then these verses aim us to the end of time. If you believe we're referring to Rome, then this takes us to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. If you believe this is continuing to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes, then we believe this then refers to all those events that we just read in Daniel chapter 11. That is the persecution and the destruction of the holy people under Antiochus Epiphanes, basically in the 140s or so BC, where they were almost removed from the earth as a people. That the Jews were so heavily persecuted under Antiochus that they began to worry about would there be Jews left because of his intensity of his persecution. And then if you jump into the dual, that it's both a then and a future, then it would be referring to Antiochus or AD 70 under the Roman Empire, and then also aiming to what it will be like when the Antichrist comes. Is that confusing? This is your chance to ask questions. So then Daniel 12, verse 8. If you don't understand, you are not alone. Daniel says, "I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. And blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." So, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 6, the question is asked, how long? How long till the end of these wonders? He gets an answer, and then Daniel says in verse 8, "I don't understand. I asked you how long this was going to be. You've given me this answer, but I do not understand." And so then we get the how long, which is comforting from the Lord, that he tells him, listen, this is it. I got nothing else to tell you, so here's the time frame, 1,290 days. And so I think when you do 3.5 years, remember there's a times a time a half, and so we get that to 3.5 years. Well, 3.5 years is 1,260 days. So then I think we have to ask ourselves the question, why 30 more days? If we've already been given this 3.5-year window, and then Daniel's told, well, it'll be 1,290 days. Well, that's more than 3.5 years. That's 3.5 years and a month. And then the next sentence, and add 45 days more to that. And so this is where I hope everybody takes a deep breath and goes, man, there's a lot we can learn about trusting the Lord in this, and maybe not as much specificity about everything as we want to have. This could be giving us a time frame towards the end of the rule of the Antichrist. This could be giving us an almost 4-year window with the Roman Empire when they began to attack Jerusalem and destroy the temple between 66 and 70 AD. And this could also be referring to the last 3-ish years of the rule and reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Or we can go with option 4 as well and say that it's both the end time and the reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. And so if it's Antiochus Epiphanes, then you could, if you wanted, you could say, and this is where I get kind of uncomfortable being definitive, but you could say that it refers to the time frame when he gives the edict to destroy and the time frame that it is destroyed. That would get us to 1290, close, and that the 1335 could then be referring to the time it took, the 45-ish or so days of what we call the Maccabean Revolt, where when he took the temple, and remember, Antiochus, we talked about it last week, he puts an altar to Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, which Jesus refers to in the Gospel of Matthew as the abomination of desolation. And so that's what the book of Daniel is typically referring to as the abomination of desolation. Early Jewish interpreters would have labeled this as that when the altar to Zeus was set up, that was the abomination of desolation. And so for it to be in the future, then you would then have to say that the city of Jerusalem will be rebuilt as a city for God, and that the temple would be rebuilt, and that then the Antichrist would then go into the temple of God sometime in the future and do something similar to the abomination, like putting up an altar to Zeus. That did happen in the 140s BC. And so some people would say the 1335 is from the 1290. That's when the Maccabeans began to revolt, and then that's when they revolted, and that's when they got the temple rededicated and put back in its place. Other people would say that is when Antiochus died. And so I think the best thing for us is to be like, we don't know. We don't know. I just think that's the best answer. I'm giving you the group's answers, but I think when you get to that point, the best thing you can do is be like, I don't know. I don't know. Obviously not the people in this room who are the wise who understand. And if you are one of the wise who understands, then we would love to hire you to be on staff with us here at Harrisburg. And so I honestly think the wise becomes the faithful and the people who trust the Lord because of what happens when he aims us here, this last little thing, but go your way to the end. He says in verse 12, blessed is he who waits and arrives. And I really think the wisdom that's here is not a wisdom of knowing the specifics of what's promised, but a wisdom in the way that we live. And that's how I would land the plane with the book of Daniel in general. And so there's kind of two kind of big theological truths that I would land the plane with from Daniel chapter 12. Because I think there is a wisdom that's meant to be gained from this. There's a way to live. Kathy, that was a great setup. Appreciate it. And so that we do get here. And one of those is that God's plan and promises are unfolding, and he will be faithful. I mean, I know that the temptation with something like Daniel chapter 11 and Daniel chapter 12 is to let everybody go home feeling like they know exactly how the events of the future are going to unfold. That'd be the best way to send people out, in a lot of people's opinions, with the book of Daniel. However, I think that the end of the book of Daniel, this last vision, actually tells us differently. That knowing every single detail is actually not what would be best for you, that there's something here that God is giving us that is true for us and that is good for us. So I take you back again to the context here. Daniel is troubled leading up to Daniel chapter 11 and 12. Daniel is troubled. God told them that they would be in captivity for 70 years. Sent a letter from the prophet Jeremiah to Israelites that were in captivity. That would be Daniel, probably the most prominent of the Israelites that were in captivity. So Jeremiah, remember, Jeremiah is a prophet in Judah. Daniel is serving the Lord over in Babylon, and so he then gets a letter with all the other Israelites, and that letter is Jeremiah chapter 29. And that letter tells them that they are going to be there for 70 years. So now the end of the 70 years comes. Daniel starts, as it gets close to the end of the 70 years, Daniel begins to ask the Lord and begins to pray. And so from Daniel 9 all the way until here, we begin to get this interaction between Daniel and the Lord. Lord, how's it going to go? And so God begins to tell Daniel and give Daniel visions that it's going to be restored. Jerusalem's going to be restored. I'm going to keep my promises. The temple is going to be rebuilt. And then the temple comes to its screeching halt. The city's rebuilding comes to a screeching halt. That's the book of Ezra. And so then now we have Daniel asking God, are you going to do this? And God says, absolutely. Absolutely, I'm going to do this. By the way, Daniel, after you, there's going to be 4 other kingdoms. The 4th of them is going to be unlike any other kingdom. And when that kingdom is over, that kingdom is going to break into 4 different kingdoms. And of those 4 kingdoms, 2 of those kingdoms are going to rise up greater than the rest of them. And then they are going to go back and forth. And it's going to have an impact on the people of Israel because they're going to do all of this in and around the city area we would now call Palestine. That it's going to be between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, these descendants of those 2 great rulers from Alexander's empire. And that's going to happen. And Daniel, so he just tells them, absolutely, this is going to happen. All these other things are going to happen, and you can trust me, Daniel, I'm going to be faithful. You guys got free after 70 years, just like I told you would. And the temple's going to be rebuilt, just like I told you it was. The city's going to be rebuilt, just like I told you it was. We have to remember this vision from the Lord is to bring comfort and assurance to Daniel. God's going to be faithful. So I think that's one of our biggest takeaways from the book of Daniel, is not to get caught up in the timing of events and the chronology of history and when can we look for this and when can we look for that, but instead, to Daniel, I believe the Lord is telling him, hey, listen, you need to be okay. Yes, it's stopped right now. These events happening, these kings and their promises, there's stuff happening. It's stopping the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Yes, Daniel, absolutely. It has stopped right now. But just because this happens doesn't mean that you need to have to go and lose everything and doubt me. And so I think what God is giving Daniel here is something that at the end of his life, after serving the Lord in captivity under multiple enemy kings, you can trust me. You can trust me. And what I have found in pastoring and just being in the church my whole life and then now doing ministry for 20-something years is we get in very similar situations. The older we get, the closer we get to feeling like we're losing our relevancy, or the closer we get towards death, the more things begin to change around us, even in church life, the more we get to wonder, is it going to be okay? Is it going to be okay? And I think in a similar situation, here's Daniel, it's not going to be fulfilled in his lifetime. It's not going to happen. This is what Daniel gets to walk away with, this vision from the Lord. He's going to die before all these things happen. He went into captivity as a teenager. He's still in captivity. He didn't go back with everyone else, and had he gone back, he still would not have seen all of these things completed. So he's given comfort. Listen, it's unfolding, and you just got to be faithful to me because I'm going to be faithful to you. And so I think that's one of our biggest takeaways from the book of Daniel, is that we would recognize that God is faithful and that he's going to be faithful. So Daniel, you keep serving me, which kind of leads me to the next thing, that God's people are called to be faithful. I mean, he's faithful. Like that makes sense. He's going to be faithful, so we should be faithful. But based on how the book of Daniel ends, we are called to be faithful when it feels like he isn't coming. Like that's really where I think the book of Daniel lands us. And I really think if you were to ask me what I think the main point of the book of Revelation is, I would say this. Same two things. God is faithful, and we are to be faithful even when it feels like he isn't coming. And why would I say it that way? Because that's how Jesus said it. In Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, let me read verse 45 through 51. Who then is the faithful, Kathy, hear this, and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes.